Okay, we'll make a start, and I'll make a start by saying, look, it's great to see so many of you here again for another talk in our Generative AI seminar series. And today's speaker, as you can see, is Dr. Bonnie Stewart. So Bonnie is an associate professor of online pedagogy and workplace learning at the University of Windsor in Ontario, Canada. Her work has long explored the implications of various different kinds of digital systems for institutions and for society at large. And today she's joining us to give what promises to be an engaging and important talk about the potential and practical realities of generative AI and their implications for agency, participation, and democratic engagement. In terms of format, we're going to go for something like 45 to 50 minutes of a presentation, and then a bit left over for questions and discussions. As usual, those of you not attending live and just watching the recording will only get the presentation bit. So colleagues attending live, you can post questions to the Q&A area in Zoom. And as before, you can also upvote, but not downvote, the questions of others. I know you're very busy, Bonnie, and I know it's morning time over there. So thanks very much for accepting my invitation to do this talk for us. Over to you.
It's my absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for having me. Good morning from Canada. Good afternoon, Ireland. I am, like Garrett said, someone who's worked in digital learning for a long time, although my focus has really always been working in education and teacher education, focusing on participatory methods, ways to use often digital tools, but also classroom practices to open up people's connections to each other and also to sort of study the times that we are in. And the times that we are in are very interesting. So to an extent, this will be sort of a 5,000-foot view of my perspective on this moment as someone who has been in this field for a long time, but sees it changing pretty drastically. I will kind of go through some ideas about digital infrastructures. I know that doesn't sound very exciting. AI on the menu, big AI hype, and then agency and democracy are sort of the four convening ideas for today. And there will be a couple of times when I open things up in the chat. So if you know where your chat is, it's at the top of the screen, and I do welcome some engagement there. But I just want to start. This is a picture, I believe it's of Houston, Texas. So it's a big American kind of sprawling city. And I want to think about infrastructure that surrounds us. And when we build infrastructures around the way that we live, we need to understand them. And I think that this is true whether they are freeways or whether they are digital infrastructures, because here we have these lovely people driving down a giant freeway, and here we have the very same freeway after a flash flood. And it's not a very good day to be the dude in the truck or on the forklift trying to get people off of the freeway. But when we don't necessarily design our infrastructures for the environments that they're in, we can end up essentially flooded. And this quote has been guiding my work in technology for about 25 years at this point, from Donna Haraway, from the Cyborg Manifesto, which is a really interesting way of thinking about technology and politics. Technology is not neutral. Sometimes people say, oh, it's just a tool. This would say, no, not really. We are inside of what we make in the same way that we are inside of the freeway infrastructure when we are driving. And it's inside of us. We are living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones get made and unmade. And this provocation is a guide that I sort of want to put out for us as we begin to think a little bit about this current moment that we're in. Many years ago, someone that I worked with in digital education said something to me that has stuck with me since. What he said was, really, there are three logics in society that sort of guide the way that modern late 20th century, early 21st century society operates. And one is the logic of business, right? We live in a capitalist society. The logic of business says that we need to do things for efficiency and profit. Great. There's the logic of media, which says that we are in an attention economy and we need to do things that will get in front of other people's eyeballs. We need to get our messages out and hone our messages. And we've certainly seen like an amplification of the average person's capacity to do that with the digital rise of social media, because it got rid of some of the media gatekeepers and turned us all into our own PR people. But that's had its own societal impacts. And then there is the logic of education. And the logic of education, as framed to me many years ago, was kind of the balance between the other two that makes it possible to live in a democracy. The logic of education is the one that values our ideas of knowledge as an inheritance, a public good, a commons that we can all share. And it is built on the participatory values of democracy and learner agency. The idea that one person has a voice, one person has a vote. People need to hear from each other and connect together and together build a society. And I guess I want to first find out if that is resonant for you folks. I've spent a lot of the last year and a bit doing a fair amount of sort of critical AI conversations in Ontario, in Canada, and in different parts of the world. And one of the questions that I will ask folks is kind of, what are your education values? So maybe I will open up the chat, and if folks were able and willing to share a few ideas about the things that you value in education. What do you think are the key ideas of education in the chat? I would love to hear from you if you're game. But I will also put this up, which is something that authenticity, thank you, Shane, critical thinking, love these, openness, public good. I'm seeing a lot of the same things that are on my screen: honesty, societal leveler, critical thinking, credibility, knowledge itself. And if you look at this, I have sometimes done these in Mentimeter participation. Thank you, Maureen. Fairness. On the screenshot that I've got from a Mentimeter talk with some other folks, I'm seeing also things like inclusivity, equity, as someone here just said, empathy, curiosity. These are really, I think sometimes people frame these as nice to haves. I actually think that these are the things that make us want to live in a society. Facilitating intrinsic motivation to learn, contribution to society's growth, okay. Empowerment, betterment of the individual and wider society, okay. These are all valid. It is really important, I think, that we keep some of those possibilities that education offers, that logic of education present in the things that we do, even in, and I'm going to move forward now, so thank you very much for participating in the chat part, even in an education system where the infrastructure around us has become more digital and datafied than it is actually bounded by the four walls of the classroom. I don't know, did these Fisher-Price schoolhouses, were these a thing in Ireland? Because when I was a kid in the 70s in North America, these were the coolest toy that a person could own. And you had little people and desks inside, and had a handle and you could carry it around. And I loved it. But the schoolhouse is no longer bounded by these four walls. It is very much a bunch of digital infrastructures that have been cobbled together, often with a variety of extraction possibilities, a variety of data governance rules around it. And it is complex to keep our minds around. But as that began to grow, I was working in digital education. And what drew me to it, I don't know how many of you remember Web 2.0, or that idea that the internet opened up a world where rather than just reading books and reading encyclopedias that were all published by publishers, if you wanted to contribute to knowledge, right, to the abundance of knowledge, you had to go through a publisher, a gatekeeping system, a journal publisher, whatever. Suddenly, with the rise of the internet and the Web 2.0 era of the internet, you could read things that other people wrote, but you could also put your own things out there. And if people saw them, they would see how to get to your site. They would see who you were or who your pseudonym was if you were doing it anonymously, but they would have a sense of connection to you and where you kind of lived on the internet. And that was a very participatory model, a commons of connections that allowed people to contribute to the world that we live in and the things that we think in our time. And as a teacher, I loved this, right? I was initially a high school teacher who has now worked in higher ed for more than 25 years, but I have always worked with educators. And for me to be able to bring my teacher education students and my master's and PhD kind of scholar students into this world where, yes, here are, the shoulders of giants, great ideas, but also you too can contribute a page, to quote from Dead Poets Society. This was great, but we can't have nice things for long. Platforms, right? Digital platforms were still the basis on which people were doing much of the contribution. Initially in Web 2.0, a lot of people did actually have their own domain or their blog on the internet. Became Facebook and Twitter started to make it so people were gathering and building many more of their social connections on platforms that we didn't own. And after about a decade, those platforms began pushing out the participatory values for their own profit, right? Logic of media, logic of business. And we've kind of ended up in a world that looks and feels sometimes a little bit like this beautiful bathroom that I personally would not necessarily wish to use. But my own campus is a Microsoft campus. And just last week, Microsoft, in its infinite wisdom, gave us a nice change where we came in and suddenly everything in our emails was kind of moved around and the sent messages were in a different spot than they had been before. And it can feel very much as a user like walking into your kitchen in the morning and finding out that someone has moved the fridge. It's discombobulating. And also you really don't have very much control over your private space. I did my PhD literally on Twitter, both in as a topic. I looked at how academics were using Twitter as a participatory space. And I also did it literally on the medium of Twitter in many ways, because I pulled all of my participants from Twitter. I constantly kind of posted and talked openly about the process on Twitter, got a lot of my support from Twitter. And then along came Mr. X and he shot it dead. And that experience has been resonant for me in terms of reminding me to think about the power structures behind the platforms that I use in digital education broadly, because the locus of power in higher education, further education, education broadly, has shifted to people like Elon Musk who own the platforms that we use. And there are some real agency challenges there for educators. Now that AI is on the menu, there is also this giant elephant in the infrastructure that's kind of threatening to eat up all of the conversation. So thank you for coming to another conversation about AI. I'm curious, I'll open up the chat again here. This is also a slide that I have occasionally used in some mentee conversations with audiences, and it's obviously meant to be tongue in cheek, but do you think Gen AI is a dystopian nightmare, a sometimes useful tool, a glorious future, or all of the above? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, oh, whoops, my bad. I will open up my chat again just so I can see if folks have any thoughts on that. What's your vote? A sometimes dystopian, glorious, useful tool. Yeah, fair enough. Sometimes useful, many times not. Dystopian nightmare, sometimes useful tool. Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. I actually, maybe not our glorious future, but I do think that there is a lot of all of the above in the reality of our current moment and generative AI. I don't buy the user refuser polarization that I've seen rise, particularly on LinkedIn in the past year, where folks who use it and are really interested in the ways that they can use it started to frame the people who are concerned about using it as in kind of a Luddite frame. Although I don't think Luddites were actually bad. They were trying to protect their means of production and livelihood. I also don't think that the people who use it are doing a bad thing. For many fields, there are so many really interesting uses, optimizations, etc. But my conversation, because the work that I'm doing is from that 5,000-foot view, I'm looking at kind of the whole system of higher ed and digital higher ed and what AI is doing to it. And I actually think whether we find great uses or refuse to use it, it doesn't matter. We're kind of all in what may or may not be a version of this truck. And I think it is important that we think about it from that big picture level sometimes, because whether you're using it or not using it, if the truck goes underwater, you're not getting very far, and you may not be able to get out of the truck. So just a really quick kind of background on how I am looking at AI, largely in terms of like learning perspectives. I'm seeing it as algorithmic. There is a real promise of personalized learning as like a step-by-step pathway that each individual learner needs to get to a goal, right? So if you are doing, I went to a presentation here a couple of weeks ago on AI and math. Math has a lot of right answers. There are some really interesting ways in which AI enables math educators to potentially think about the computation aspects of what they are doing differently and focus on different kinds of skills. There are many ways in which it can help people get to particular goals. But what it is drawing on, for the most part, to get people the answers that they are looking for, it's based on predictive statistics, and it is trawling from what is already on the web. I am currently in Prince Edward Island, Canada, which is where I grew up. I actually live in Ontario now, but I'm kind of here visiting my mother. And this is a small island, a lot of fishing and a lot of scallop draggers. And years ago, when the scallop draggers, which trawl the bottom of the sea, came out, it really disrupted a lot of the local fishing industry. Not in a positive disruption way, but in a really damaging people's livelihoods way. And I think that has probably impacted some of the ways that I see that sort of trawling. But AI can only work with knowledge that is already out there. If you need formulaic format writing, GenAI is a great jumpstart. So if you're writing things like cover letters, letters of reference, even lesson plans, and this is coming home pretty hard, not just in my classrooms, but in my entire province. Our premier has just announced that they will have standardized lesson plans for most classrooms going forward in Ontario, and the general assumption is that these will probably be fairly heavily GenAI generated. It's also great for things like if you have too much email. you can train a small model AI in trauma-informed responses to give the 200 students, for instance, who might email you in a given week, a thoughtful first point of contact that then directs them actually to the people who can answer their questions. There are a lot of ways in which the time saver productivity element, I think, can be true. There are also studies showing up that are saying that a lot of the businesses that have adopted AI at scale are not actually finding over the long run that the productivity gains are as high as initially promised, because it's the time that people need to spend going over things in order to actually have accurate answers. That is the balance, but mileage may vary. It very much depends on the individual context. So people are having very widely different experiences with this, but overall, time saver for sure. There's also, since Google basically turned into an AI search situation about a year ago, search has become a lot of people's kind of main starter use for AI. Even people who never intentionally went to ChatGPT as a site are Googling, and now that's what they're getting is AI responses. In the States, this was a survey from last year. 57% of students have ended up using AI to search for information, partly because it's very hard to avoid, partly because it is actually great at kind of giving you a starter intro view into a topic that you don't know much about. And kids are young. There's a lot of things that they don't know much about. I am not young. There's still a lot of things I don't know much about. And the AI starter view, I tend to go to Wikipedia after I get the AI piece, but the AI piece is more concise and it's interesting and it's kind of useful. But this picture on the right is there should be a credit on there. Nick Sousanis is the comic artist and scholar who made this, talking about learning. When we are looking for algorithmic answers, AI can be very useful, but that is not all learning. And so those of us who tend to work in the more gray areas of knowledge, whether it is the humanities, the social sciences, things where we are doing participatory education and students are meant to learn from the people around them, as well as from one central text or answer, I think this comes more easily than maybe it does to folks who are in more right answer fields. But any field, no matter what discipline you're in, AI learning is very seldomly like that A to B experience represented at the top, right? Because what we actually learn as an experience of kind of becoming, we make mistakes, we struggle, we get surprises, and we create pathways in our own minds to understanding. And that's a big part of what learning is. And it is a big part of what the concept of learning is in terms of our educational values. Most of those words that you folks put in the chat relate to people's internal experience of becoming and growing as a human being. Ursula Franklin, again, this goes back to 1989. I have really moved back to some of the basics of media and digital theory this past year in my teaching, because I think we are now kind of reaping the whirlwind of 40 years of a given direction in digital tools, and particularly the last 20 years. But Ursula Franklin was a Canadian scholar at the University of Toronto. And in 1989, she gave a series of national lectures called the Massey Lectures. This happens in Canada every year. And she talked about technology. And she particularly made a distinction between holistic technologies, as she framed them, and prescriptive technologies. And she was a metallurgist by trade and discipline. So she was thinking about historically the ways that cultures have used tools. She looked at sort of holistic technologies as the types of tools that people use when we are thinking about craft, could be knitting needles, could be a hammer, could be actually a fairly complicated tool, but something that supports a certain amount of individual judgment and decision making on the part of the crafter or the user. Right. And I don't know if we have any crafters in the room or folks who do things with their hands, but a lot of the things that you do with your hands, particularly if you're working, largely alone or in small groups, tend to be holistic uses. Prescriptive technologies. As a metallurgist, Ursula Franklin was studying how ancient Chinese society 2,500 years ago had developed the capacity to create these giant cast bronze kind of urns, objects that weighed almost a ton, and how with the tools of that time they still managed to do this without killing everybody involved, because molten bronze is obviously dangerous, especially when you're working with a ton of it. Prescriptive technologies are much more like an assembly line model. And Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. It clearly has precursors back as far as ancient China. Prescriptive technologies require each person to operate with precision, right, in a prearranged way. With holistic technologies, the worker's in control. With prescriptive technologies, the worker is under control. And we shouldn't forget, prescriptive technologies are exceedingly effective and efficient, which are keywords with which we are being sold AI. But Ursula Franklin warns us they do come with an enormous social mortgage or a culture of compliance. When a tool prioritizes efficiency over agency, it is prescriptive. And this is the work of Dave White in England. He's been talking about the process of learning itself is not primarily interested in efficiency, but the output, right, that we actually focus on in education when we're getting students to create essays or assignments or do tests, it's meant not to create a bunch of essays, right? We don't win as educators because our students create more essays. We win if our students show learning in those essays. And so when we are bringing in a tool en masse that focuses primarily on sort of the outputs or the widgets, we are moving towards a much more prescriptive system. And part of what can happen there is something called cognitive surrender. There's a study, chatbots can do a lot of things, but when people rely on them 80% of the time, they may not develop the capacity to actually process what's happening in the thing that they are supposedly learning or doing. And the thing about cognitive surrender is that it means a loss of agency. If we give away our capacity to make and understand knowledge, right, we give away our agency. If as a society we give that away, we also are threatening democracy, because democracy is built on the individual right and responsibility to use our agency, use our vote, use our voice. There is a fair amount of work coming out around how the affordances of AI are a threat to institutions, not just like higher ed institutions, but democratic institutions writ large. And institutions are very flawed. But at the same time, institutions are largely the way that we have sort of built up and preserved the idea that we do live in a society that is not just about each person for themselves. And AI systems are at the biggest picture level, even though they're very useful at the sort of close-up level, potentially threatening to this, particularly in terms of knowledge. They diminish our awareness of the commons of society, this image of kind of people connected to each other with an awareness of where the ideas come from, whether it is from talking to people, whether it is from being in digital exchange with people, whether it is reading the work of someone who died 200 years ago, but in a book, we still have some sense that there was an individual person out there who thought that thing. When all of the information is centralized into AI and fed back to us, we lose that connection, right? That sense of the source of information. the sense of where our ideas come from and the real principles on which they are built, but also how we can reach out and rely on potentially the people who have had those ideas. There's also a sycophantic element to Gen AI that is a bit of a problem. And we've seen much more serious impacts of this in some of the youth using Gen AI for a therapist, and it student says, or a youth says something like they want to harm themselves, and the AI, because it is sycophantic, will build up that idea. This is a more of a funnier version where somebody literally put some gas effects and asked what AI thought of its music, and it got the mood is consistent, the minimalism is good. Gen AI is a weird interlocutor in that sense because we don't necessarily get the criticism that we need to think better. This was obviously meant to be a joke, but that creates losses because in a prescriptive system, we don't necessarily have the capacity to evaluate what the machine is giving us, right? It creates a loop of sort of we're feeding it stuff. It tells us what we want to hear. We don't get our critical thinking built. And in the end, at that big picture 5,000-foot level, if we can't evaluate what the machine is giving us, we're not using a tool, we're being used by one. And particularly for students, where they don't develop the critical thinking and writing that many of us have had the privilege of building over our own educations, they won't be able to solve problems when something actually breaks. This is a Guardian article. It has pointed out that there is a lot of knowledge that is not in the internet and the web. There is a lot of global south knowledge. There are a lot of people's particular perspectives that AI does not represent or does not even know. And as we centralize what the AI feeds us, risks becoming sort of the truth and having a whole lot of knowledge lost or elided, even more than it currently is in the systems that we have had. And yet, for all of those problems, right, AI is on the front lines of this consolidation of power between billionaire companies, many of them coming out of Silicon Valley, and politics to kind of feed AI, particularly into our education systems. And again, lots of local level uses. But at the big picture, I want to consider what that means for us. Why is it happening? Part of it is that AI is this kind of, it's wielded as almost a magical term. It's from 1955, but it's still being used to mean the future. And some futures are actually really just hype. Hype is a core element of all Silicon Valley releases. Gartner is a company founded in 1995 in Silicon Valley that trademarked this particular image in front of you. It's called the Gartner Hype Cycle. It has existed since 1995. And basically, it is the pathway that all Silicon Valley trends and tools and all big tech trends and tools follow. It's released. A new innovation is released. The logic of media comes to bear. The logic of business comes to bear. The media reports on this innovation. This is happening. It's going to be a tsunami of change. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be the next big thing. It's going to be the future. And then investment goes in. And so that upward arc is the place where, by design, the money goes into all of these trends and tools through venture capital, angel investors, etc. We get to the peak of inflated expectations where amazing things are going to happen. And then, actually, because most of these innovations, trends, and tools are just ideas that people had and want to make a great buck on, some of the air goes out of the bubble and we go down to the trough of disillusionment. And then usually, if the tool or trend has any value to the field that it's been released into, there's kind of a plateau of productivity where it finds its own kind of mid, this is okay, here's its place in the world, but it is never as high as it was promised to be. Basically, a hype cycle is a speculation boom. It is an invitation to put money in because you might get rich on the next big thing. But it is a speculation boom that is in search of a functioning business model. And AI is the biggest hype cycle that the world has ever seen. And that is why every single company and every single industry and education, because we wouldn't want to be left behind, and we've been sold, and our decision makers have been sold the idea that this is the future. So here we are at the front end of a tuba with AI in everything. The upshot of this is that I think we actually need to start talking about big AI as something distinct from the technical capacity of AI and Gen AI. And when I'm talking about like the local uses that you can find and the things that are cool, we're talking about that technical capacity, what AI can do for you. But big AI is this socio-technical kind of assemblage of billionaire business logic, the idea that tech is the solution to our problems. And unfortunately, it's merged with a very anti-democratic politic, particularly in the US, but we see it in elements across the world because it is a tool of control, right? And it's sold to us, deployed as innovation. But I think we need to start talking about the control risks for us as a broad society if we give over all our power to this. Because big AI wants public money and youth practices locked into this before that hype cycle slumps, right? And this made me laugh. The Microsoft chief saying, you know, this AI boom could falter. He's talking about it as an economic thing. But we keep hearing this is inevitable, and yet also it could falter. We are not actually decided where this is going. Big AI is not about agency or democracy or the educational values that you folks shared earlier. There is an element to which a lot of governments that don't necessarily want to govern or want to follow sort of the democratic publicly funded education model see real value in these tools because it has the capacity to create a society that is very dependent on these tools. These are fairly prescriptive looking futures, right? When we hear this is the only option, but we don't hear those same governments saying, okay, we're going to get everybody using AI and gradually a lot of jobs will mostly be done by AI, but we're still going to make sure we take care of you. That latter part of we're still going to make sure we take care of you in a world where everything is getting more expensive is not happening in most conversations. Even here in Canada, where we do not have an overtly we have a very different government from the US at the moment, but still we have a very technocratic government that's very excited about AI, but is not actually telling us, okay, if we do give over all of our fields, all of our work to these systems that will automate all these things, how are we going to have a society? How are we going to be housed and cared for? What will be put back into our society to preserve it? This is diminishing meaningful democratic process. We had a scholar actually from the Sorbonne who was applying for permanent residency in Canada. And our immigration department used AI to review her application and wanted to know why she wasn't farming. There is not yet a lot of accountability for those kind of errors. And she had the capacity, to speak out publicly about this, but there are a lot of folks who have less power, less agency than she did, whose lives and trajectories are being deeply affected by these kinds of automated decision making who can't speak out about this. And ultimately, this big AI push, also threatens kind of our right to information. Sam Altman is the pictured on the right. He is the CEO of OpenAI, the company that released ChatGPT. He sees a future where intelligence, which he sees in units, is a utility like electricity or water, and people just buy it from us on a meter. For all of us who are in education, one, that is a field threat existentially, but it is also a situation where existing inequality will get even worse because only rich people will have access to his intelligence. So this is a very significant shift in how our democratic concept of all people having some value in a society and right to knowledge, education, information, a fundamental shift in societal beliefs and essentially a removal of the logic of education from the logics of business and media as a way of going about doing the work of civilization. But my final ancient theorist, Marshall McLuhan, also a Canadian big media theorist in the 60s and 70s, he said in 1967, there is absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to think. So I invite us not to turn against AI, but to at least be aware that we do not need to buy the future that big AI is selling us, and rather try to cultivate some agency over the prescriptive infrastructures that are being pushed on us. We can choose alternate tools. This is a site that you can actually use Google without AI. It's the old Google before AI started giving answers. There are also all kinds of ways to use different search engines, etc. We can choose alternate generative AI, right? There's Justice AI, GPT, that is focused a little bit differently on the types of knowledge that it supports. We can have real and serious conversations around agentic AI, which is very much a threat to the concepts of education, because if you put an agentic AI into an LMS, a VLE, a learning management system type online tool, it can simply go through and complete all the requirements. We need to think about how we are structuring higher education and education so that maybe we are not making this available to people. As a sector, I think that our cost benefit analysis on AI just needs to be more guided by the educational values that most of us do honestly share and believe, right? We need to look at kind of where we're going and think about what we want to bring along with us, and not necessarily be as open as we've been to tools that have not been asked to be accountable for their more negative big picture elements. And we need to remember what learning is for, right? A lot of people are saying, oh, like school isn't even necessary. AI can do this for them. We're grading students on essays that AI writes better than their teachers. I love this answer. And gym classes are making them run miles, and Uber could cover in less than a minute. If you go to the gym and you use a forklift to use the weight or to move the weights get moved, but you don't get all pumped. If we want students to be able to think, then we need to think about what learning is for and really focus on that, and not give away the big agency pieces. And some of this can be holistic digital practices. It doesn't mean we can't use digital tools. It doesn't mean we can't use AI, but things like participatory pedagogies that focus on connection and meaning, people connecting to each other, to ideas. Those are ways and things that we know how to do, that can actually keep education focused on people building those assessment and judgment capacities and connection capacities that strengthen our capacity to be a society. And we can focus education on learning and capacity for judgment. Like we have been defunding things like the humanities for 20 years, maybe longer, but it is a discipline that trains interpretation and criticism and ambiguity tolerance. And in some ways, protecting and fostering not just those disciplines, but those capacities in every field is probably the only way that we sort of push back against the prescriptive elements of big AI in this future. I think the main message, education is not actually just about preparing students for the future, even though we've gotten sold that. It is about preparing students to care for the future and shepherd a future so that we can continue to hopefully, live together in something resembling a civilization. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate you listening and being here. And I'll
Well,
stop sharing.
we really appreciate it as well, Bonnie. So for the sake of the recording, and in case I don't get a chance later, I'm just going to say thank you so much for your talk and for your thoughts. I think your own deep and long engagement with the impact and the influence of all things digital on higher education institutes and individuals and societies really shines through. Among other things, I think you've given us a lot to think about and get clear on in terms of generative AI as a potentially useful collection of tools, maybe, and generative AI as a
Yep.
force pushing and ushering in different visions of the future for higher education and for society in general. So many thanks for worrying us more than we were worried already, but also for offering us
I'm a
some.
sunbeam.
You are. But also you've given us some really good thoughts there in terms of how we can resist and question those potential futures. So we're going to say goodbye to those watching the recording at this point.